There we go. All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Amanda Beverin. I am the Director of Housing Advocacy here at the Community Development Partnership. And thanks so much for joining us today for our Spring Regional Peer Group. This peer group is part of the Lower Cape Housing Institute, a program that provides education, resources, and support to the municipal officials of the 8 Lower and Outer Cape towns. And we do that through workshops, peer groups, and technical assistance. Our peer groups are held quarterly. This is our spring peer group, and this is a space that's a little bit less formal than our workshops, and it's for housing advocates to discuss topics surrounding housing, to share updates and ideas, to celebrate victories, to commiserate around challenges, really whatever it is that you all need to support you in working towards your town's housing production goals. We're here to provide it. We have a really great agenda today. We had such a robust conversation at last month's workshop about local preference that I decided to have us continue exploring it. Let's see if I can share my screen here. Let's try this one right there. All right, can everybody see that?
Yes.
Awesome. All right, so here's our agenda for today. Use the chat or raise your Zoom hand with any questions. We are going to start off with Donna Kalinick and Jill Scalise, both from the town of Brewster. They're going to give us a refresher on local preference, what it means, how it works, who's eligible. They're also going to share some insight from some of Brewster's recent lottery experiences. And then I'm very excited today to have Roger Blood, the chair of Brookline's Housing Advisory Board, with us. Brookline went through the process of changing their local preference policy in 2020. And so Roger is going to talk to us about what went into that and what that process looked like. Then we'll follow up with some Q&A, and we will close out, as we always do, with our town updates, and we can cover housing and spring town meeting warrant articles. Thank you to everyone who sent in information for the slides. Amount of content on the slides does not equate to how much all the different towns have going on. I tried to condense it all down to easily readable bullet points, and some of them were easy to do and some of them were a little bit more complex. As always, we will send out slide decks, resources, and notes after the fact, and we'll also have this recording for everyone as well. So without further ado, I am going to turn it over to Donna and Jill to talk to us about local preference.
There we go. I can unmute myself. So good afternoon. It's so good to see everyone. I'm Jill Scalise and here with Donna Kalinick, and we're just going to share about local preference, regional preference, and Brewster's recent experience. And this is based on a presentation that we gave to the Select Board, Housing Authority, Housing Trust, Housing Partnership, Community Preservation Committee, and Finance Committee in August. We go. So just a little bit about it. It's going to be about how does local preference work? What does local preference mean? How is it implemented? And Brewster's experience. So the material that we're sharing today really mostly comes from the guidelines that come from the state, from, it says here, Department of Housing and Community Development, now Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities, EOHLC. And there's links on the bottom here, so you can click right to those guidelines. This presentation will be available to be sent to everyone by Amanda afterwards, and also the Affirmative Fair Housing Marketing and Resident Selection Plan guidelines. Now, for a municipality to request local preference, if a municipality wants to implement local preference, the first thing it must do is demonstrate the need. And that's part of the Affirmative Fair Housing Marketing Plan. And one of the ways you do that is showing that you have a waiting list for applicants to apply to a project, that you have wait lists for your subsidized housing inventory or public housing waiting lists. And also you need to justify the extent of that local preference, the amount of units set aside, but that can never be more than 70% of affordable units. And this is part of what Laura talked about last month. So specifically the protected classes based on Federal Fair Housing Act, and you have to demonstrate that proposed local preference will not have a disparate impact on protected classes. So those are race, color, national origin, religion, sex, disability, handicap, familial status, and children. And then there's additional protections that we find here in Massachusetts that you can see listed as well. So the process that goes to kind of the how-to, how does it work? And again, this is just a refresher, is that the municipality must provide the developer and the subsidizing agency, which usually in our case, we've dealt with the Office of Housing and Livable Communities, documentation required to support the local preference request within 3 months of the issuance of a comprehensive permit. So there is this timeline, this time frame that you're looking at. And both the subsidizing agency as well as the municipality, the town, must approve the local preference as part of this affirmative fair housing marketing plan. So it's just one of those things. It can't be approved as part of a comprehensive permit. Sometimes folks look to do that in the comprehensive permit. That can't be done that way. It really is a separate process and needs to have that approval from both the town and from the state or from the subsidizing agency. The big question we really get is who qualifies for local preference? And I'm going to pass this over to Donna to talk a little bit more about this part.
Okay, great. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. And just kind of going back, Jill, could you go back to that last slide just real quick? I think one of the things that's important here is that if you as a municipality have a project that you're developing and you're moving along through that process, one of the things that we always do is develop a timeline for things to happen so that we never lose track of the fact that we have to make sure we request that local preference within 90 days of the issuance of the comprehensive permit. So we really recommend, if you're working on a specific project where you know this question of local preference is going to have to be discussed and decided on at some point, that you work up a timeline for everything to happen. Maybe it starts with the request for proposal and then moves through that. And we do have timelines that we could share if anyone is interested in that. And we're constantly updating them as the process moves along. So who qualifies for local preference? The allowable categories include current residents, so folks who are living in the community at the time of the application, municipal employees, employees of local businesses that are located in the municipality, and households with children attending the locality's school. And we're going to get into that in the next slide because we have some factors that come into play with regional districts and other types of schools. So we thought it might be helpful to share a couple of examples. So when the town of Eastham did the village at Nauset Green, because the village at Nauset Green was located in the town of Eastham, and so is Nauset High School, there was local preference for students in the Nauset Regional School District. So that included both the high school and the middle school. It was because you were a student of that district. For the Cape Cod 5 Penrose and Main Street Housing Assistance Corporation housing projects, because Nauset Middle School is in the town of Orleans, there was local preference again given for students in the Nauset Regional School District. So students from Brewster, students from Eastham, students from Wellfleet, students from Orleans, were all eligible. And this also includes kids who are coming in through school choice. So that really broadens who is eligible. So interestingly enough, we've had to explain, well, we're in the Nauset district, but if we build something in Brewster, we don't physically have a school, a middle school or a high school in Brewster, so that same Nauset Regional District preference doesn't qualify. However, in the Nauset region, there is an preschool program, and it is shared by the 4 towns. And one of the physical preschools is in the town of Brewster at the Stony Brook Elementary School. So the children who go to that preschool, we could have kids from Eastham or one of the other Nauset towns who go to that preschool in the Stony Brook, would qualify for Brewster local preference. So this is just something we've found we've gotten a lot of questions on as we've had discussions about local preference.
Sorry, I'm having trouble with it moving forward here.
Is there a little arrow on the bottom? Oh, there you
There
go.
we
You
go.
got it. Okay. So what are some of the guardrails that exist for local preference? So when determining preference, the area can't be smaller than the municipal boundaries. And when we talk about regional preference and requesting regional preference, and we're going to give you an example of what the town of Brewster did around that later, we're talking about Barnstable County, so you can't specify it to the upper or lower Cape. A regional preference is for Barnstable County. In terms of durational requirements, it isn't about how long someone has lived here or worked here. If they or has gone to school here, if they entered the school system a week ago, they will qualify for local preference. There's also preference can be extended to local residents who have a bona fide offer to work in the community or have a pending purchase or lease of a home in the preference area. Some of these guidelines and guardrails, it's part of the reason why you really need a lottery agent to help you conduct the lottery. So a few of the other guardrails that are in place is that a preference for households must not discriminate against people with disabilities or elderly households. And also, when you have an advertisement, a flyer for or any type of lottery that's going to take place, that flyer will, or advertisements that are associated with it, are not allowed to mention the local preference that is involved, because that might actually discourage people who would otherwise apply, because they might think, well, I never have a chance to come live in this great community. And this is super important. We say it over and over again every time we talk about it. Local preference only applies to the initial sale or lease up. So once that initial sale or lease up is done, the local preference aspect goes away.
I'm going to walk through kind of a nuts and bolts, thank you, Donna, about how does local preference actually work? How does the lottery work? And again, as Donna said, the lottery agent oversees and completes the lottery process. And that's because, and that's by an approved lottery agent from the state needs to approve. And it is a complicated process. So first, the number and type of pools will depend upon the specific projects. And a project with an approved local preference will have 2 pools. There'll be a local pool and an open pool. And local applicants will be placed in both of those pools. For projects with a local and regional preference, there will be 3 pools, a local pool, a regional pool, and the open pool, and local applicants would be in all 3 of those pools. Regional applicants would be in the regional pool and the open pool. So now the guardrail of minority balancing. The percentage of applicants who identify as minorities in the local preference pool must be equal to or greater to the percentage of minority residents in the metropolitan statistical area. For our towns here, that MSA is Barnstable County, and the 2020 census figures, the percentage of minorities in Barnstable County was 15%. So minority balancing is required if the number of minority local residents in the local pool is less than the 15% for Barnstable County. That's how it works for us. So if that happens, that there are less than 15% of minority applicants in the local pool, then there would be a preliminary lottery comprised of all minority applicants who are in the open pool. And after that preliminary lottery, then minority applicants would be added to the local pool until you reach that 15% threshold. And this is really key about affirmative fair housing marketing. If there are not enough minority applicants in the open pool to increase the local pool to that 15%, then additional marketing must happen to attract additional applicants, because that means you're not marketing well enough. You haven't gotten out the word to enough people of all different backgrounds. And again, minority applicants who are chosen for the local pool will also be in the open pool as well, just as any other local pool applicant would be. So here's an example of how something would work. So you've got a 40B comprehensive permit that's been approved. It's 40 units, and 25% or 10 of those units are deed restricted affordable units. So there will be an affordable lottery for the initial lease up of those 10 affordable units. So we're saying here you have 70 applicants for these 10 units, and that's the open pool, 70, and of those you have 10 minority applicants. But then the number of applicants in the local preference, folks who live, work, or have a child in that local school system, has 30 applicants, including 2 minority applicants. Well, if you do the math, 30 applicants, 2 minority applicants in the local preference pool, that's 6.7%. Then you go to step 2, where you assess 6.7%. Does that greater than 15%? Well, if we go back to elementary school math, no, it is not. So therefore, is minority balancing necessary? Yes, it is. So then step 3 would be the balancing process. So you'd hold a preliminary drawing of all the non-local minority applicants, and they would be ranked in order picked, just like from a regular lottery. And then the folks, number 1, they would be added to the local pool until you reach at least 15% of the minority applicants, which again is that number from Barnstable County. And in this situation, you'd need to add 3 applicants to the local pool. So then you'd have 33 applicants in the local pool, of which 5 are minority applicants, and that's 15.2%. So you can just see how that's a guardrail, a balancing mechanism for that. So what we really like to share is, what have we seen in Brewster? How has this worked? And we have 3 recent projects. The first is from Habitat for Humanity. And in Brewster, we found it really helpful to dive into our data to figure out what we should do and how to move next and to make future decisions. And this is what we based our decisions on. So for Paul Hush Way, which was 14 homes built by Habitat for Humanity in 2 phases, there was a 70% local preference granted. And part of that, I just note, one of the things that Brewster looks at in determining local preference decisions is how much of a town commitment is involved in this particular initiative. And so we had over $1.3 million, almost $1.4 million in Community Preservation Act funding for both purchasing the land as well as for actually doing the construction of the homes. There was an affirmative fair housing marketing plan. There were 157 applicants in the 2 different phases, and 49 applicants qualified for the lotteries. And we looked at the data, and both the lottery pool and the actual home build selection, who ended up building and living in those homes, both demonstrated a fair and diverse representation of qualified applicants. So that was above the minority percentages of Barnstable County and of the town of Brewster. For Brewster Woods, we have 30 rental apartments. Again, a 70% local preference request was granted. Again, this was Housing Authority land. We had Community Preservation Act funds, as well as a $1.68 million Mass Works grant that the town received. There was affirmative fair housing marketing for 27 of the units. 3 of the units were through a special program for a certain type of disability, so it didn't go through the lottery process. And these were affordable at 30 to 60% of area median income. There were 240 applicants, 128 applicants qualified for the lottery, and there were 40 applicants in the local preference pool. Again, there was fair representation and no minority balancing required. And interestingly, I looked up the data and figured it out, and the local preference pool had over 25% of minority applicants, and the open pool had around 22% of minority applicants. So there actually was a greater percentage in our local pool than in the open pool. Just kind of, again, just seeing how is this guardrail working. Another project we've had recently is Serenity Apartments at Brewster, which was the renovation of a former Wingate assisted living facility. And this is 132 apartments for folks age 55 plus. And so 27 of the units, 20%, are affordable at 80% of area median income. There's no town funding whatsoever in this project. And the town of Brewster, because of that, made a decision to request 50% local preference, and also an understanding that there are many folks in surrounding communities who are also, looking for this housing in the local, and they would not qualify for local preference. So there were 72 applicants, 53 qualified for the lottery. There was minority balancing used in this lottery. There were only 3 minority applicants in all the applications total. And there were 14 applicants in that supplemented local preference pool, and all of those 14 applicants were actually offered the opportunity to move into apartments. They didn't all choose to, but they did all get that opportunity at initial leasing. And then most recently right now is Habitat for Humanity. We have 2 homes being built on Phoebe Way. These are both affordable homes. The town actually gave up its local preference for a veteran's preference in this particular build, and the town was asked to do that and agreed to do that. So they did, through their affirmative fair housing marketing, did receive veterans that were eligible. And so one of the homes is being built by a family with a veteran, and the other an open pool. And I do want to just note, there's no local preference for single affordable home sales or for affordable home resales. Because a single home is 100%. It can't, that's over 70%. So that's not possible. And even if you have a couple resales at the same time, no, it's still, there is no local preference for affordable home resales. And we just had a 212 Yankee Drive, a lottery held last month on the 20th of February, and on the 21st of February, 11 Sean Circle, an affordable home resale. So in 212 Yankee Drive, I mean, the town totally rehabbed that and put a lot of funds in it and all, but this is the process. There isn't a local preference in those situations. And now I'm going to pass it on to Donna to share about our latest.
So I did want to add, Jill mentioned in making some of these decisions, what are some of the things we're thinking about. Over the last couple of years, I would say that the housing office has also, continues to receive many, many calls from people who used to live in the town of Brewster and lost their housing, were unable to stay in the town, were living in a surrounding town, or in some cases even off Cape, mostly living in a surrounding town. and really wanted to come back and live in the town of Brewster again. Many of them had lived for over 20 years. And so that's something that weighed on us, that when you ask the maximum local preference, those folks who may at one time been community members, their opportunity to move back diminishes. So that's something that isn't data that we have, but it's something that qualitatively we've taken a lot of calls and talked to a lot of people about. So the town of Brewster owns a little over 16 acres of land off of Millstone Road. It took us as long to create a name for this as it did to develop the parcel, but it's now officially Spring Rock Village. And it will be 45 units of affordable rentals, a mix of 1, 2, and 3 bedrooms, up to 80% of the AMI. So there's a mix of units at 30, at 60, and at 80. There was CPA funds used to purchase the access parcel. This was a landlocked parcel that the town owned for a long time and could not develop on because we didn't have access. So we were able to gain access in 2018. We went through the feasibility study, community outreach, and then issued a request for proposals in 2021. We awarded to Preservation of Affordable Housing and Housing Assistance Corporation. The select board entered a land disposition agreement in 2022. And the comprehensive permit was approved in 2023. There was $500,000 in CPA funds that were granted in November, this past town meeting, and we do expect them to request $1 million from the Housing Trust in the next coming months. They are officially in the winter funding round right now. So we had a big decision to make around local preference. And this is under the purview of the Brewster Select Board. However, we have worked very collaboratively in the town of Brewster between the Housing Partnership, the Housing Trust, the Select Board, the Community Preservation Committee, and the Housing Office. So as Jill mentioned, we did hold a local preference information session with all of those boards and including the Finance Committee, who had a lot of questions about local preference as they were hearing various CPA applications from surrounding towns, projects. And so, we're really excited about the fact that the Brewster Select Board chose to ask for a combination of local and regional preference. So what was ultimately requested from EOHLC was 55% local preference and 15% regional preference. And, as Jill described, you have to document and have data in order to make this request. And I would say that EOHLC, when they received this request, they said, what are we going to do with this? So we did have a little back and forth with them around the regional request, but ultimately our ask of 55% local preference and 15% regional preference was granted by the state. And this, in all of the discussions that took place, particularly on the select board level, was a recognition of the efforts of our region collectively to provide more housing and housing options, not just to the people who live in our town, but to people across the Cape. And I think that this was a really good outcome, and we hope that it's a model that other towns will look at, at least considering some regional preference.
Thank you
And we
so
do
much.
so. Thank you. That's it. We do just want to thank Laura Schufelt. Some of these slides were in part from a presentation she gave to the Home Consortium last year.
Laura is the best. We love her. Thank you so much, Jill and Donna. We are going to go straight to Roger's presentation, but if anyone has questions, one of my team members is monitoring the chat, or hold on to them, and then we'll do questions about both segments once we're done with the presentations. So now I get to make sure that I can figure out how to share Roger's presentation after 3 years of Zoom. You'd think we'd be faster at this. All right, let's try this.
Cool.
All right, do we see the slides?
Okay, we're all
All
set to
right,
start.
Roger, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Amanda. I certainly appreciate your invitation to us to join your discussion today. What I was just watching now, extremely interesting from our perspective and our distance from the Cape. Let me begin just by introducing Emily DeHogue, who's joining us on the Zoom meeting today. Emily is the senior housing planner in Brookline's planning department, and we work very closely together on everything relating to affordable housing in Brookline. Maybe I can begin with giving you a quick sense of the Housing Advisory Board and what it is and where it fits in the larger picture of things. Why did this particular policy discussion and eventual change originate in the Housing Advisory Board, and how did it end up, as a result of our work? We're a volunteer citizen board created in the late 1980s. At the same time that Brookline, I think this was fairly early, also instituted inclusionary zoning bylaw, and the genesis of our now very active affordable housing trust, dormant for many years in the early days. And the Housing Advisory Board was then charged, I refer to it kind of our three-legged stool mission of no particular order of priority, but developing housing policy recommendations, overseeing the inclusionary zoning bylaw and keeping that current and effective. And also the members of the Housing Advisory Board are at the same time the trustees of the town's Affordable Housing Trust. So we have three different hats that we wear. The bylaw creating us required that appointed members have a variety of very specific skills relevant to affordable housing, such as finance, development, planning, architecture and design, etc. And we also have several members who are kind of on the other end of the affordable housing equation. In other words, they live in affordable housing, including with being clients of the Brookline Housing Authority. So we have had affordable housing lotteries for decades. I've attended them myself for many years. Of course, all of it was in person pre-pandemic. And one of the things that I had the privilege of observing, directly and working with the respective staff members who were doing all of the heavy lifting and the detail and the main administration, was having the chance to view the actual applicants who came, or those who chose to come into a crowded room, looking for hitting the jackpot in a way. In Brookline, if you win an affordable housing unit, we call the affordability gap between a market rate 2-bedroom rental unit and the affordable value or price is well over $500,000 a unit. So it's got quite quite a zing in Brookline when you're a winner of the lottery. So the room full of folks that I observed who had qualified as pre-qualified as applicants for the lottery was a virtual melting pot. It did not at all reflect the racial or diversity of Brookline itself, or the lack of diversity. So for many years prior to the HAB, I'm going to call us the HAB Housing Advisory Board, stepping up and trying to make a policy move with our lotteries, there was an enormous disparity between what we would see in the pool of applicants and the local population profile. By 2020, there was also a growing sense in the community that we should be looking for various ways of expanding the diversity and the welcoming of the town towards minority households, not just in housing, but much broader than that. I at one point just brought a general question and setting a monthly meeting agenda. Should we take a look at this? And there was unanimity among the HAB members at that time. Yes, we should take a look. So our next step was to request from our housing division staff and the planning department if they would do some further inquiry, evaluation, research on this, and report back to the HAB what they would find that would be germane to our considering whether the ongoing long-term 70% standard, which we had, and I'm sure many other communities, simply taken for granted because it was kind of coming from the state, although it was only a maximum, it was never a minimum. And what I'm going to share with you now is the PowerPoint presentation that our then staff member, whose name is David Guzman, he is now over with the Cambridge Planning Department, or I would have him joining us today because he really did the detailed work on the ground on this. But we'll steal some of his slides and share them with you to the best of our ability. If you can take the next slide, please. So the agenda and the objectives of this study, as I mentioned, were to assess the implications of our local preference, the existing 70%, in the context of racial equity and fair housing. And should the Housing Advisory Board initiate a process of lowering the town's 70% standard at that point, or conceivably eliminating it entirely. Next slide, please. Got a couple of columns on this slide. I'm not going to take a lot of time in the detail of it, but and you heard a very good description of the Chapter 40B comp permit side of this, which you've experienced certainly in many communities on the Cape, and we've had quite a share of it in recent years in Brookline, where we haven't quite been able to, but have not quite made the magic 10%. But we also have the same question of local preference applying in our local inclusionary zoning bylaw and any other affordable housing proposals that may come up. So on the local side, it only the formalities only apply to home ownership, but informally, whatever we recommend to the ZBA, which has the ultimate authority, they have tended to look to the HAB and go with in terms of local preference and other recommendations. The beneficiaries, I think you've already heard from your Cape presenters, and Metco you may not be as familiar with, but that's a long-standing program of some Brookline suburbs that welcome African-American, mainly African-American high schools or public school students from the Boston school system. And very early on, way before the 2020 move on local preference, we expanded our local preference definition to include Metco student households. There are, as you know, no local preference applications on resales. So we're talking entirely here on the initial lotteries. You heard earlier about having agents, third-party agents, specialists with the skills to run the lotteries. And that's been true in Brookline for most, if not all, of the 40Bs that have some scale to them. And our staff has reported for years that the state has nudged and tried to make it more difficult for communities to run their own lotteries. And we've somewhat resisted that trend or that sense. And so we do still run the smaller scale lotteries. And so our staff has continued to understand how to do this and to you know, run them by the rules. Interesting, the transition from all of the in-person to the virtual lotteries now, where the software, and you may all have experienced this, but the use of the software on the screen to assure absolute neutrality is just a random number selection, and it's done in an instant rather than a much longer that part of that process. So next screen, please. Brookline is not particularly diverse racially here. Most notably, African Americans, only about 3% of our population. And this is racial, so Hispanic is actually, you'll see later, divided by Hispanic white and Hispanic non-white. Our Asian population has grown very rapidly and is continuing to do so. I think that's essentially what you're seeing on this slide, and part of why we've gone where we've decided to go. Next slide, please. So the challenge was to try to avoid the discriminatory effects in our lotteries in what is clearly, in our case, a highly majority white, but also now growingly Asian community. David, who conducted this research, did identify for us possible constitutional concerns, including limitation on right to travel, violation of the Equal Protection Clause, and provisions of the Fair Housing Act. However, the figurative bottom line on this that he gave to us was that with all of that, no court has held that residency or local preference policies are per se illegal, and that HUD has endorsed at least the proper use of such policies. Next slide, please. So the basic approach that David used in preparing this and then reporting back to the HAB, he reached out to neighboring communities. We're part of what's known as the West Metro Home Consortium. So that was a primary list of nearby peer group communities that he spoke with. We looked at the racial breakdowns in the 40B permitted projects that we had done, and also our local inclusionary zoning projects. And he conducted a series of phone interviews with folks whose organizations I think you're mostly otherwise familiar with at the state, and Mass Housing Partnership, who's helped us in a lot of ways over the years. And then use the demographic data from the census and the American Community Survey. Next slide, please. And so what we found, or what the staff found from this, was that our peer group communities basically use local preference policies, and I don't believe he encountered any that had broken the line in effect from the 70%. And that the intent is actually to favor current residents in allocating very scarce and very valuable costly housing resources. I think it was interesting and certainly true, and you're further along with CPA than we are. We're just going through our first round now with seeking major funding from this new CPA pot, which is $10 million the first year for its uses. Excuse me. But the other intent, which I think has been true all along, has been more political than financial, is that to maintain sufficient support for affordable housing, many communities have felt, perhaps with more or less justification, that the 70% high preference level what had a lot to do with continuing community support for affordable housing in general, where there's a lot of, speculation. We didn't really see much of that in Brookline, I will say. So we may have had more politically of an I don't want to call it easy opening, but to take the action that we were contemplating for sure. And as we had previous description of, the communities are applying the 40B marketing selection guidelines for eligibility of the units to be included in the subsidized housing inventory, as we did. Now I'm not as aware as perhaps I should be of the extent to which, if at all, we had to do the kinds of upward adjustments in the local preference pool to make it was your 15% threshold, and in our Boston metro area, I believe it was 27%. But I know that our 40B developers and their agents certainly did comply with that. Next slide, please. Well, kind of self-evident here that our affordable housing lottery data reduced the likelihood of, especially African Americans, opportunity to win an affordable unit, and conversely, the experience of our pools reflecting Brookline's racial lack of diversity was favoring white households. Next slide, please. Just a few quick examples. I'm not going to dive too far into the weeds here because although there was a lot of work developing this data, the red numbers are basically what tell the story, at least from the HAB's perspective of simply wanting to know what level of justification there was for considering reducing the 70%. The biggest number here is in the white Hispanic line, almost 10%, and that's not 10%. It's 10 percentage points between 21% for all applicants and 11% in the local preference applicant pool on that particular line item. The disparity is actually not as large as one might have expected in the Black, Hispanic and non-Hispanic lines, and American Indian. The data is so small as not to be statistically significant. But the jumping out of the red on this slide is certainly no surprise. Next slide, please. This was a 40B rental, another 40B rental also on Harvard Street. In this case, the most significant line item is Black, non-Hispanic, where there is a major disparity between all applicants at around 14% and the local preference applicants only, basically a quarter of that at about 3%. So this was a literal red flag for us in that project. Next slide, please. And a very different kind of project, not a 40B, but a town-owned property, formerly an underground municipal reservoir in a very upscale neighborhood known as Fisher Hill, now called the project Olmsted Hill, where we did moderate income, all affordable moderate income condominiums. And here, again, you can see the negative disparity in the African American Black line item, but also slightly on the white side as well. We're dealing with small numbers here, so you're not having the very large pools that would be, much more statistically significant. Next slide, please. So the findings, no surprise, evidence was indicating strongly the use of our local preference pools and the selection of our buyers in our majority white municipality was having the effect of excluding minority households, in effect decreasing the likelihood of their selection in the lotteries we were running. And David found in his other outreach research that other municipalities were having the same experience. Next slide, please. All back to the Housing Advisory Board. We received this report, put it back on the agenda for consideration. What were the implications of the report, and should we consider lowering our 70% threshold. All of the HAB members at that time agreed very easily that we should seek to lower. And perhaps the more interesting discussion, at least from where I was sitting at the time, was how much. And on that question, there was a remarkable range of views from at the minimum action end, reducing, but all significant, from 70 to 50. Others felt cut it roughly in half, 70 to 35, or flip it 30-70 to 70-30. And there were other HAB members that advocated for eliminating it entirely. Our staff, which we always listened to at that time and still do, felt that we should not eliminate it, that we should reduce it, but that there was still significant demonstrated need within Brookline, including residents of the Brookline Housing Authority and other low-income residents, that they should be recognized. And also, apropos of what you were presenting earlier, while we didn't have CPA funding at the time, we were funding through the HAB in the millions of dollars, many affordable housing projects, and not just with the Public Housing Authority, but also with local nonprofit sponsors. So there was that logic too, that local money should have, to some extent, local beneficiaries should follow to some extent. So great debate. It wasn't heated, but we landed eventually at a unanimous vote to reduce the 70 to 25, which was pretty aggressive in some ways. And then the town government procedures being what they were, I've always said the HAB's middle name is advisory. We have no absolute power, but we do get a lot of things done because we managed to persuade others. The planning board and the select board, without any real pushback, both endorsed our recommendation, and it became effective. The Zoning Board of Appeals has taken this into account and hasn't done anything differently ever since. Your main question, and I'll finish on this, look forward to your Q&As, but I'll anticipate one question is, well, how since this was 2020, what have been the statistical results, since then? I can't really report anything significant. The lotteries, pandemic, post-pandemic, haven't been frequent enough to give us really, I don't think, a sense of solid findings statistically, although we're convinced there's no way other than it has to move in a direction of more diversity. I would like to ask, and I always do in everything we do locally, if Emily DeHogue has any comments or any corrections, actually, or suggestions on the presentation, if she wants to say something. But thank you very much.
Thank you so
Thanks,
much.
Roger.
Yeah, Emily, if you want to unmute yourself and give us some comments, please feel free.
Yeah, I don't have any direct comments, but I think that it is a good move it has been a good move for Brookline to show that we want more diversity, especially in our subsidized units.
Well, thank you all very much. We enjoyed the opportunity to visit the Cape on such a nice day.
Thank you, Roger. Okay, I'm going to stop our recording.